Slave soldiers, or Mamluks, mamalik, have had an interesting history in the Islamic world. A history that involves the rise and fall of some of the greatest political entities in human history. A history that stretches far back in Islamic history, as slave soldiers probably existed in early Islamic history, but increased in importance in the Middle and later Abbasid period, and would be used by various political entities in North Africa and the Middle East for a long time afterwards, after the decline of the Abbasids, with famous examples including the Bahri Mamluks of Egypt, who even took control of Egypt from the Ayyubids in the 13th century. Later we have the infamous Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire, and the Abid al-Bukhari, the slaves of al-Bukhari, also known as the Black Guard, a unit that was active until the 20th century in Morocco, even if by the middle of the 19th century they had mostly been replaced by salaried soldiers instead of the traditional tribal levies and slaves that had made up the unit before. So we do have a pretty long history of large-scale usage of slaves as soldiers in Middle Eastern and North African history. You might be wondering, why did they use slave soldiers? Why was it used for such a long time? And why were not other types of soldiers used? Well, there has always existed a need for soldiers throughout history, for warriors that you can use to wage war, both to defend yourself and to conquer territories. Especially in pre-modern times, where communications, diplomatic agreements, and security was harder to uphold, and thus conflicts were more common. And thus there was this need for troops always throughout pre-modern history. To further add problems regarding the availability of troops in the Islamic world throughout history is that conscription has generally been seen as forbidden, according to various Islamic traditions. Conscription here being forcing free men to go out and fight. Slaves not being free was a way to sideline this issue of Islamic law being against conscription. A convenient loophole to use to get troops. Especially as paid professional free all-time soldiers were usually too expensive to maintain in large numbers, in comparison to forced slave soldiers. For example, the decreasing tax revenue during the late Abbasid period, due to rules regarding taxation in the Sharia in most cases, meant that more slave soldiers were used and less permanent paid troops, as slave soldiers were cheaper and thus could be afforded by the Abbasids to be maintained as a permanent standing force that would fight for them. Of course, the Abbasids and many later dynasties also had other types of soldiers that they could use, but these other types of soldiers had their own issues. You had volunteers that could volunteer for campaigns, but these were usually only used for offensive wars, as then you could offer booty to be taken, and that was one of the main reasons as to why you would volunteer in an army in the Islamic world during the medieval age. And even then, only if people trusted the skill of a commander or the word of the leader, they would really join as volunteers in an army. So they were unreliable in that sense. You also had allied troops under various vassals and troops connected to various mosque congregations, but these were usually of questionable loyalty due to tribal affiliations, and it was uncertain even if they would provide troops or even join the enemy against you in certain cases. Thus they were not reliable in many situations either. Slave soldiers, as I will discuss, also had loyalty issues, but it was in certain ways less so, as no direct oversight existed in case of those other troop types. But with the slave soldiers, you had direct oversight with the direct ownership from the central authority. So they were better in that regard than these other types, which were dependent upon the goodwill of various local authorities for gathering an army. And due to this lack of control, slave soldiers that the central ruler had better direct control and oversight over were preferred over other troop types, at times, though slave soldiers were usually mixed with these other types of soldiers that I have mentioned. They weren't the lone type of soldier, and I've actually made a video about this. Link is in the description. Also, slave soldiers had a benefit of always being there as troops and available for the year around in a way that the other allied and vessel provided troops were not, as they were not permanent troops under the command of the central authority or ruler. Slave soldiers served here as a kind of counterweight also, to be used against other forces within the domain that could be used against the centralized rulership. As the use of military forces have historically been very decentralized in Middle Eastern and North African history, and thus local leaders and polities within the domain of a greater sultanate or caliphate could challenge the central authority at times, and thus slave soldiers were a good way to provide a counterweight to this local military power, as they answered directly to the rulership and were relatively cheap in comparison to paid permanent troops that were free. They also had other positives in terms of training quality. Remember, these are slave soldiers that trained their entire lives at times for doing war. So well-trained permanent troops, and that had not that much of a choice to quit, as they were, after all, slaves and couldn't really quit, or else face punishment. And it should also be remembered that a lot of these slave soldiers, be they Mamluks or Janissaries or the like, were taken as children. Thus, fighting in wars was like the only skill they had and the only life they knew. And thus, even with freedom, they might have not been able to even go into a civilian life either. Hence, you had pretty reliable troops here that didn't have much of a choice but to fight and continue to fight. These Mamluk slave soldiers also tended to be well equipped too. For example, look at this armor. If you keep a slave alive and train him for war through several years, from childhood to adulthood, then you will equip them well, as this is a costly investment you have made. Not as costly as having a free man that you pay for this entire time, but still a pretty costly investment, where it makes sense to armor them with the best armors and give them the best of weapons to fight with. Due to the history of Mamluk soldier use or slave soldier use being so long, they were taken from many places. In the beginning, during the Abbasid period, most slave soldiers were Turks or Slavic peoples taken from the north, though a lot of other sources too were used to get slave soldiers. During the Fatimid era, imported Turks were used, taken from Central Asia, but also African slaves were used from the south of the Fatimid domain. And in the late Middle Ages, Renaissance time, North African entities took their slaves either in raids on coastal European towns and villages or from sub-Saharan Africa. And the infamous Ottomans took their Janissaries as children from the Balkans in Europe. In short, slave soldiers were taken from everywhere where you took slaves. And like other slaves, they weren't always the most loyal to their masters, as I will discuss now, with the main issue connected to the use of slave soldiers. At many times in the history of the Middle East, the Mamluks, the slave soldiers, began to develop an identity as a class with their own interests and character. You could call it a class consciousness if you would use Marxist terms. They were slaves, even if very well treated slaves. After all, you don't not want to anger your soldiers and warriors that fight for you, but they were still slaves. And thus a bit of resentment towards their masters always existed. And in addition, they were also the main force and holders of the capacity of violence for the centralized authority and rulership. Thus they were in a position to make revolts and to get a great amount of power versus the rulership that depended upon them. And power plays and revolts were not uncommon throughout Middle Eastern and North African history. Sometimes slave soldiers revolted and created their own dynasties. For example, the Tulunids, the Ikhshidids, and the later Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt all were Mamluk dynasties that arose due to successful full-scale takeovers made by slave soldiers in revolts. And even when it wasn't full-scale takeover, the slave soldiers could act as the kingmakers and powers behind the throne that chose successors and removed rulers without taking direct control, as direct rulership by slaves would be improper after all. And thus you had them influencing politics and trying to force their politics throughout history through several dynasties and greater polities in the history of the Middle East and North Africa. For example, the Fatimids had constant issues with infighting with various Berber allied troops, sub-Saharan Africa and Turkic Mamluk slave soldiers under them, especially under the reign of Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, who had to be very brutal in his handling of the factionalism that existed between various slave soldier factions in the Fatimid Caliphate. You also had the Black Guard being involved in the turmoil of Morocco in the years between 1727 and 1757. Even the Janissaries and the Devshirme system of the Ottomans, which evolved from the earlier Mamluk slave soldier systems of the Middle East and had introduced various methods of control, ultimately failed in controlling the Janissaries as a political force. For example, in 1632, the Janissaries attempted an unsuccessful coup against Murad IV, who then imposed a loyalty oath on them after they had failed. On the other hand, they were more successful in their coup attempt against Ahmed III in 1730, where they managed to dispose of him, but their rebellion eventually got crushed. And in 1807, a Janissary revolt deposed of the Sultan Salim III, who had tried to modernize the army along Western European lines, removing the Janissary corps formally, but was hindered due to the coup. And it would not be until in 1826 where the Janissaries would be disbanded permanently under Sultan Mahmud II following a Janissary uprising that he managed to quell. You also have a lot of other minor examples here too, from various Janissary revolts and Mamluk revolts throughout all of Middle Eastern and North African history. But it was a recurring issue that slave soldiers either tried to influence politics, acting as a political faction with great power, or tried to do revolts, replacing rulers, or even taking full control for themselves. But as a Middle Eastern or North African ruler, you did not have many alternatives to slave soldiers, as you were pretty much forced to use slave soldiers, due to both the situation regarding conscription and the other sorts of troops being unreliable to depend upon, and the economical nature of taxation. Last one though did not apply so much to the Ottomans, as the Ottomans did develop a tax system very separate from the older systems based upon Islamic jurisprudence. Yet they still depended upon slave soldiers because they were important as a component of their military armies and as an alternative to regular troops. I also want to say one last thing about slave soldiers, and that is that they were soldiers, which is also why they were treated so differently than other types of slaves in the Islamic world, to the degree that they almost do not appear as true slaves. But slaves they were, even if they were well-treated slaves, generally, due to the fact that you do not want to anger the people that make up your military forces, the people that enforce your rulership, and ensure that you stay in power and have the power to dispose of you. But again, slaves they were, and some of these slaves were taken as children, never to see their families again, and to be brought up and educated in the arts of war, to fight, forced to fight to the death at times, but at the very least risking injury and death, fighting against an enemy, sometimes for the very same people that enslaved them, and against the very people from where they were taken from. Sometimes intentionally so, as an element of subjugation and as a terror tactic to break the morale of areas that were resisting the centralized rulership by having them fight their taken relatives in their army, by having their taken relatives commit massacres upon them. To constantly live under the fear of having your children taken as slaves and used in these armies against you. And I wanted to draw attention to this fact of slave soldiers actually being slaves at the end of this video, due to the fact that there is a certain element of glorification of these slave soldiers, or ignoring of certain aspects of them, like them actually being slaves in certain parts of history, in certain types of history, that I think should be contracted. And I hope you agree with me, my viewers. If not, you can comment in this comment section, and you can also ask questions, as I am always open for questions. And also please like this video. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.